So, um, I think one of the big influences that I had observing film as a medium, and particularly the work of these Asian filmmakers, was the sense of time and how time is sort of continuous, and really there's something mysterious to how time passes. And I think that when you're experiencing, because there's duration, of course, the duration of a performance, so whether it's 20 minutes or 90 minutes, and there's how time passes within the world of the play or the film, but there's also how time is being experienced by the audience, and that relationship is very interesting to me. And there are ways that one looks at it, both formally and both in terms of the writing. And I think that influence has come to me very strongly from film more than any other medium. But there's also aspects to the aesthetics of the work that we do, and maybe if I can speak specifically in terms of Quicksand. So I think previous plays, people have always, this has been a quality that people have talked about actually, both in complimentary fashion and as a criticism of my work, which is that the work is cinematic. So people say, oh, it's very beautiful, very cinematic, and some people say, I don't know why you're directing plays. You should be, if this would work much better in another medium. And I think that one thing I'm very curious about is that I think that now in the time that we are, it is possible to imagine a post-cinematic theatre, because one often thinks of cinema as being a descendant of theatre as a dramatic form, and photography as a visual form, and but I think now we're in a time where other art forms are influenced by the cinema very distinctly. So you have forms of music that are cinematic, forms of sort of post-rock instrumental music that draw a lot from the cinema. Literature has been influenced by the cinema, and certainly I feel like theatre has been influenced. And there are exciting points there. There's also dangers there, because I find a lot of actors nowadays that I work with, also because I have often worked in this sort of realist mode. Realist is also a word I have very huge problems with, because why is unreal? What is unreal? But if one were to say a kind of sort of naturalism, and so actors are excited by that because they feel like it's film acting on stage. But then there are enormous challenges to that, which is many of them keep mumbling all the time, and in theatre you don't have like sort of boom mics over your head. But I think two aspects that strike me as interesting to talk about. This first is sound. I find, and I found when I was starting theatre to work in the theatre, that I found most plays that I watched extremely visually chauvinistic. So it's like a lot of thought about the image and how it's looking, and color and costume and light, but really not much thought about sound, except to have the lines clearly delivered. And I found this very dull. And when people used score, it was used in a very obvious way. It was usually sourced music. So you're watching a professional play by a reputed director, and suddenly you have the soundtrack of Mask of Zorro or something like that. And it's embarrassing, because it feels like you're willing to invest in actors, you're willing to invest in costume, but sound, which is actually the cheapest element that you have in the theatre, because sound technology is really kind of available to us these days, was I didn't find people investing in it. So from my first play onwards, I worked very closely with a composer, Samar Grewal, who's composed for almost everything that I've made since then. And so not just score, but how does sound exist? And there's two aspects to this. So most of my earlier work uses ambient or diegetic sound, which is sound from the world of the space, in a very real way. So even if it's just crickets or the sound of traffic, and it's always both an indication of time and space, and I use it as an element because everything on stage is very spare. We've never had elaborate sets. We've never had elaborate costumes. So sound has been a very intricate element. On Quicksand, we made a very conscious decision not to do that because we wanted really the silences to be silence. And that's another element I think that comes from the cinema. I think in the cinema, users can afford to use silence more. You don't find it strange in a film if for sort of 3 minutes nobody said something but people are walking and doing things, and there are films that have long periods of silence. But in the theater, somehow people get restless in their seats the moment nothing has been spoken for 10 seconds. And this is an element that we've really tested in our work. There have been plays where actors have been really kind of really sort of anxious and saying, Neel, the silence is too long. I'm just saying stay with it, because really what happens in those silences is very interesting. And I think that that's an element also that I feel like I've inherited from the cinema, this use of the use of silence, or the value of silence. I think in terms of narrative, because film works with editing, it works with kind of shorter scene structures and shorter frames, and sometimes there are just images or moments, and that's again a temporal thing. And I think that the act structure, the 3-act or 5-act structure of theatre sort of encourages you not to do that. It encourages exposition. So long scenes where you know a number of things happen and each scene has its own arc. And sometimes I feel like I've felt the need to break that, because I like it sometimes when the sense of a world or the sense of time or the sense of a character is fractured or broken, that what you expect doesn't happen, or when you're expecting something to happen, you're suddenly somewhere else. And I think that not kind of conforming to that traditional structure of how things unfold, again, is something that it's an import from how film works. So even in Quicksand, for example, there's 2 scenes that happen simultaneously in the same space, and then at one point an actor crosses the boundary, and I think audiences have reached a level of sophistication where it's not like, oh my god, no, I'm suddenly confused. Is this a restaurant or is this a I think that they're able to kind of make that leap of imagination. And that's one of the great things about the theater, is that the audience is, because in the absence of everything being real, they're in a contract with you to believe what you present in front of them. And so to actually test that belief becomes interesting, that in Quicksand, in all the interludes, characters are talking to each other physically. They're talking to each other, but these are voices from the online world. So whether it's a WhatsApp conversation or random anonymous messages to a phone or Twitter comments, it was very interesting for us to present them physically in a space with actors and bodies speaking it. And how does that change? How does that change the way you read it as language? Because we read, people talk on the internet, but we read it. We don't. It's a different form of listening, because you are ascribing tone to it. You are thinking, okay. I mean, I think all of us have had conversations online, or where somebody has reacted to something, and you're misreading or overreading the tone. And I think that was also interesting, to present something that is in a theatrical space that one experiences in different ways in the real world.
So Neel, we've spoken a lot about your process in terms of how these mediums meet, film and theatre, and how that influences image and how you look at image vis-a-vis sound. And you spoke about sort of looking at sound as something that excites you in terms of how you work with it in the space of like creating theatre. But can we talk a little bit now about narrative, and also how that connects to space, because both in terms of how space plays out in your productions and how you think of space within this confines of theatre as a medium?
Yeah, I think that again, leading on from the cinema, I think that the idea of where performances are located, both in terms of the world of the play, but also the world of the performance, has always fascinated me. The first challenge, of course, is that I think at Tadpole we by both choice and a necessity, we practice a kind of minimalist theater.
Right.
And my aesthetic as a director very much is to really have less in the space. But one has to still make that space count for something, and one has to kind of use it or design it in a way that it evokes something imaginatively in the audience. And I think that that is something that's always excited me. And in the past, it's something that we've explored, and at times I felt like as a director I've made some lazy decisions or very easy decisions and told myself, well, I don't really have a budget. So, but I think increasingly over the last sort of 7 or 8 years, it's been something that I think a lot about. And even if actors and movement are the most central element in a play for me as a director, where are they moving and how are they moving and what facilitates this movement? These are very important things for me. And because, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of narrative, I take a lot in narrative structure from cinema. So often locations change very quickly, from kind of interior house, living room spaces or a bedroom, or into suddenly like sort of much more open spaces. This becomes a challenge, and really, and I think it's an interesting challenge then for sound and light and really the kind of design of the performance.
Right.
My sort of previous production, or 2 productions ago as a writer-director, is a play called Still and Still Moving, which is set in Delhi. And the reason I mention this one is because it kind of it responds quite directly to the question that you asked, because there's 2 kinds of space that we're working with in the play. One is the space between people, because essentially it's a love story between a young student and a writer who's over twice his age. And so there is this, so there's distance and proximity in that sense, the space between people, how far apart are they from each other in their lives, in their belief systems, in their behavior. But it's also a play that's looks at some certain level at space in Delhi, because the play is set across the expanse of North Delhi, which is where Delhi University, or part of Delhi University is, and Gurgaon, which during the time period of the play, the distance between the 2 is still being bridged, because as the play takes place over 2 years, and during those 2 years, the metro between Delhi and Gurgaon, which is now kind of been around for about 8 or 9 years, is being completed. And so the narrative is punctuated by short scenes that are set on the Delhi metro, which is a very, very curious and interesting space. And so how to stage that was a very, very sort of interesting challenge for us, and at the same time move from that into more sort of interior. So they're different, right? There's interior spaces and exterior spaces. There's public and private, and then there's a combination of the 2. So you can have a public space and look at something interior in that, not just interior in terms of architecture, but also interior in terms of the moment of the play. And I think that becomes very interesting in terms of the writing and the staging, because the actors have very little set material to work with. And lighting really is an element that only comes in later, and obviously it adds a lot and actors play with it eventually. But it's also in the physical framing and choreography of a scene that really a space comes alive. And both on Still and Still Moving and in Quicksand, that becomes a very active part of the design of a production. In Still and Still Moving, the central element of the metro, and by virtue of that, a movement becomes, and of course the title also suggests so. This fracture between staying still and being in a world that's constantly moving, that becomes a slightly sort of metaphorical element.